Welcome, everyone. It's good to have you here today. Before we begin, I'd like to share with you what We Are All Related series is about. It provides opportunities to deepen relationships with people of diverse populations, cultures, and backgrounds as stepping stones to establishing connections with various speakers and valuing their wisdom in their journey. This series is inspired by Directional Statement 2, which states, "There is a deep grief for the current situations of injustice in our world that calls us to be and become the face of an inclusive, welcoming, and merciful church, working for a just, equitable, and sustainable world in which all flourish." So with that, we will open the session, and I wish to extend our gratitude to Laura Carlson, who is a composer, musician, singer, for giving us permission to use her song at the beginning and closing of our session today. In a section of this piece, you will hear Laura expressing her thoughts in Lakota, followed by an English translation. Susie will now bring us this song titled, "These Are Sacred Lands."
I can hear the bison as they thunder by, as the eagle flies above my head. In my heart, the elder reaches out his hand. These are sacred lands, he said. Do your best to rise above anything that is not love. In my heart, the elder reaches for my hand. These are sacred lands, he said. How sweet the meadow lark who sings his song, and I sing along in my head. I can see the black hills touch the morning sun. I am the grateful one, and I am fed. Do your best to rise above anything that is not love. In my heart, the elder reaches for my hand. These are sacred lands, he said. For the helping hand. These are sacred lands, Spirit said.
And we thank Laura for her gift to us today. So now I welcome two people who I've become friends over the past 2 years with, Rachel GEISSINGER and Mike HARLEY. Rachel is a senior administrative coordinator working for an environmental nonprofit, has been calling for me, and no other organization I had heard of during this time was doing the work environmental initiatives does. I enjoy working with amazing coworkers. I like the practical hands-on work that my position allows me to do. It makes me feel like I'm making a difference. It is important to me that my work leaves the world a better place for my daughter, her generation, and generations beyond. And then Mike is the executive director of environmental initiatives. And he says he loves holding together relationships that our divided world tells us cannot be held together. I love making those connections for people and for helping catalyze relationships across wide differences. In the past few years, the fullest and most joyous expression of that has been holding relationships across differences in power, perspective, and worldview, such that I can help people connect with each other across those different kinds of differences. What I was most impressed with, together with many things, which I'm sure Rachel and Michael will highlight in their presentation today, was the values that this environmental initiative hold for themselves. And they are impact, insight, intention, interdependence, whose definition begins with the statement, we are all related, justice, which calls for courageous decision-making, sharing power together in order for the best care of people in the planet, and the last value, leadership. So with this, Rachel and Mike will have decided to give a presentation of 20 minutes, followed by a period of approximately 20 minutes of questions and answers. So Rachel and Mike, thank you. I'm very, very excited for you to share. So I'll let you take over.
Thank you, Pat. This is Mike Harley. So I'm executive director at Environmental Initiative, which is the nonprofit that Pat mentioned, and you'll have a chance to meet Rachel in just a moment. But I wanted to say that I've gotten to know Pat, as she said, very recently, and just have enjoyed so many aspects of that relationship. But when she invited me to speak to this, just hearing the name of the series was all that it took, because we are all related is the most fundamental value. And I really appreciate that our organization holds, that I hold as a person. And I appreciate that you read our definition of interdependence as you were introducing us, because that is at the center of everything that we do. So the presentation we're going to give you today is about an organization that for most of its 31-year history has been what I would call a conventional, mainstream, white-led, dominant culture environmental nonprofit, like most environmental nonprofits, and that has been in a process of really active change for the past 8 years. And so we're going to talk about that process of change for our organization. And Rachel and I are also going to talk about that process of change for ourselves as individuals, as leaders, as members of the staff. So we can move to the first slide, and Rachel and I are just going to give you a little bit of context, or we can move to the next slide. And Rachel and I are going to give you a little bit of context about our faith, and how it relates to this work, and how we understand our changing relationships and our changing work. So I'll start quickly, and I'll just say that I grew up in upstate New York. I grew up Catholic. I've always been Catholic. I am a practicing Catholic now. And social justice has always been fundamental in the way that I understand my Catholic faith. Catholic social teaching has been important to me. My parents are both secular Franciscans, and so the teachings of St. Francis were important in shaping my understanding of the world, as my parents themselves were. And I'll also say, and this is a St. Francis connection, is that I've always found many of my experiences of God in nature and in relationship to the other living beings that we share this planet with. So, I've had this life of all these different aspects that maybe you're not surprised that I work for an environmental organization in my day job, in the way that I get paid. But I will say that up until very recently, I lived a divided life. I came to understand my environmental nonprofit job, my day job, the job I get paid for, as not having a lot to do with social justice or racial justice, and really being about the environment in a different way. And so the place that I did my social justice work was as a volunteer in my church life, off hours. And I'm happy to. I'm not going to tell you more about how I lived, why I lived that way. I won't even say right now exactly what the shift was for me, but I'm happy to talk more about that in the question and answer if that's of interest to you. But what I will say about it is that living this kind of divided life keeps things neat and clean and safe. And it allowed me to keep my job confined within the day hours and go off and do my volunteer work at night. And it sort of kept life in a very orderly way. But you're meeting me now in the midst of what's been 15 years of unsettling that and letting go of a lot of preconceived notions about what is my work and what isn't my work. And you're really meeting me now in the past 3 or 4 years. I've been actively braiding all these things that are most important to me together: my faith life, my commitment to justice and to the well-being of other people, and my love of creation. And so it's a renaissance moment in my own life. It is messier, and it's more uncertain, and there's more tension, but it is beautiful, and it's the work that I'm thrilled to do. I get to do my work in a much more powerful way, and in much deeper relationship than I did for most of the years that I've been in this job. And with that, we're going to talk more about the organization, but I'll turn this over to Rachel to introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to come here. And I will tell you that with 3 years on Zoom, inevitably, I will have some sort of technological glitch. So just be prepared for that in this whole thing. I feel like the more you do it, I don't know what happens, but I always feel like, oh, I've got this. And then at some point, something happens. So just be prepared. I'm going to put that out there right now. I am Rachel GEISSINGER, and I use she, her pronouns. And I grew up what we call a cradle Mennonite in the Mennonite world, where I come from a very long line of Mennonites on both sides of my family. So both my mother and father come from very long lines of Mennonites. And so it's been instilled, and it has been a very large part of my life and my identity for as long as I can remember. So Mennonites, there are 3 things that were very much instilled from a young age at my house, which are sort of the 3 pillars, at least in our world, of what a Mennonite is. And that's simple living, pacifism, and service. And so I grew up, like Mike, finding God most closely in nature, but not really thinking about that as a career. I went to a Mennonite college, and then oftentimes in the early 2000s, what you did from graduating from a Mennonite college, if you hadn't found a Mennonite person to marry, you went and did Mennonite voluntary service, which is what I did for 3 years in Seattle, where I got to live and work for a nonprofit that was a trail maintenance organization. So I spent much time outside, which sort of altered my life course and for what I thought I was going to do with my life, and ended up in environmental nonprofits when I moved back to the States, or moved back to Minnesota. And so I have had a number of environmental jobs throughout the time. I did a stint in baking for a while, and then realized that my passion and what I felt like my life's calling was in environmental nonprofit work, and found this job at Environmental Initiative in 2019. And in a time where I was feeling more settled in who I was as myself, I was pleased to find an organization to work for where I suddenly was finding all sorts of interconnected thoughts and beliefs and talkings at both my workplace and in my church. And so I started to be able to also sort of realize that the two of them, I sort of, like Mike, had this idea that you didn't talk about faith at work, really. You didn't, you maybe said you went to church, but it wasn't a part of who you were. But working at Environmental Initiative and watching the change since I have been there for just over 4 years now, I have myself changed a lot as I've watched the organization change. And so I think the most profound way for me that has been is realizing that everything is the environment, and every issue is an environmental issue. And so I have heard that at Environmental Initiative and have sort of translated that now into the work that I am participating in my faith life as well. And so it's been really a transformative few years for me as well. I think I have rambled on long enough, so I will move on.
I was just going to say how much I appreciate hearing that story again, Rachel. Thank you. So I'm going to ground you in an organization that is 31 years old. It's called Environmental Initiative. It's based in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, but we work around the country. And for most of those 31 years, for all of those 31 years, we've said that what we do is we bring people together and we build relationships across differences. And what that has meant for us is mostly building relationships between business people who work on the environment, environmental nonprofits, and what I mean by that are mainstream environmental groups like the Audubon Society and Sierra Club, etc., and government, state, local, and federal government. So people who work on the environment for a living, or what in the environmental world is often called stakeholders. And that's powerful. We've done a lot of things, and I'm happy to tell you more about some of that historical work that we were able to accomplish by building these relationships and building collaboration across those kinds of battle lines. But the groups that we left out over those years are, as it turns out, those that are most impacted: the communities of color, tribal communities and other indigenous communities, tribal nations, and rural communities, who generally are the ones that bear most of the impacts of pollution or environmental degradation, and who are generally not the ones making the decisions that affect their lives. And so, drawing this back to Catholic social teaching, this is the way that Catholic social teaching asks us to think about climate change and sustainability and environment, that the same dynamics in our systems that harm the earth also harm the poor, harm those that live on our margins. And so, like most mainstream environmental groups, we acknowledge those realities and then didn't do much to draw those perspectives into the center of our work. So 8 years ago, we began a process of really unsettling ourselves and trying to redesign ourselves with environmental, social, and racial justice at the core of the organization. And happy to talk more about this, but lots of real loss and deep turmoil, and including that there was a period of time where I really thought that I was going to lose my job. And lots of times where I thought I wasn't sure that I was the right person to do the job. So it's just like unsettling in every way you can imagine. And I've been doing this job for like 23 years up to that point. So, I was pretty settled, and we were pretty settled. So we did all of this unsettling. We built relationships in the communities that we had previously marginalized and ignored. And we were set to really put a new understanding of ourselves in place. And Rachel's going to talk to us a little about what we decided when we did some strategic planning that wrapped up in September of 2020.
So like Mike said, when I started in 2019 was sort of the beginnings of the start of the strategic, well, it was in process. The strategic planning was in process, but I was so thankful that I got to be a part of such a big portion of what it was, and to watch the organization and the board work so hard and trying to put pen to paper and figuring out what did this new vision look like. And so you can see here our theory of change, our new vision, which feels just so appropriate when you, Pat, we're talking about, I don't know, at the very beginning when you were saying something, I thought, oh, it's like she's reading our vision statement here, where it says that relationships foster an inclusive, just, and thriving world for all beings. And that just so feels like it connects to we are all related, we are all connected. And so we can talk more about this in more depth, and if you want to, in our question and answer, but this is sort of what came out of all of the few years of hard work. And then moving to what our values have become now. These are the 6 that we talk most about, and I am going to just choose one of my favorites of the impact. And we talk a lot about impact. We have a yearly awards celebration and, nominations for work that defines impact, and what is the impact of this project that you are doing. And for so many years, it felt like the impact was how many tons of carbon have you taken out of the air and that kind of thing, which is a very important way to measure impact. But it feels like now the impact is much more about the relationships that we are creating with all of the communities, and especially the communities that are most impacted by environmental issues. And I think, no, here we go. Back to Mike.
So that premise, that concept of most impacted communities is at the heart of the transformation, the shift that we've been talking about. And when our board really began to settle into this idea that our work needs to be oriented towards the leadership of and supporting the leadership of and catalyzing leadership of those communities of color, Black, Brown communities, Indigenous communities, and rural communities, the board was faced with this decision, because the conventional way to do environmental justice work is to identify the good guys and the bad guys, and to oppose the bad guys and to support the good guys. And we had these 25 years of developing very deep relationships with what are essentially the environmental powers that be. And I'm talking about environmental groups as well as the government agencies that run the systems and the businesses that drive our economy and profit from these systems. And so that's the source of a lot of power for us, but it became very uncomfortable as we were trying to understand what our relationship to be with, say, the Black community in North Minneapolis, which is a predominantly Black part of our city, or rural Indigenous community, a tribal nation in northern Minnesota impacted by oil pipeline development. And the board really considered a dynamic of separating ourselves from those historic relationships, sort of turning against. And where they landed was that we are an organization that is not for some people and against others, that we're an organization that embraces all people in our common humanity, and that we are building bridges across those kinds of differences. And so we're holding together both those that have power and have resources and have capacity with those that are being impacted negatively by these systems that profit others. And you can imagine that's a way of doing racial justice work and environmental justice work that is full of tension, but it is full of relational power. And that's really the source of all the power that we have as an organization. So we're going to give you some examples of how this has started to show up in our work. And I think we can go to the board slide next. And I'll just tell you as one really quick example of how we've been able to change when we've become clear about how we want to do the work differently, is that in November of 2019, our board was 100% white, and mostly men, mostly older men who lived in the Twin Cities, mostly older men who lived in the Twin Cities with law degrees or technical backgrounds. And as a result of this really clear shift, our board really reflects a different kind of community now. Our board is majority people of color or Indigenous people at this point. And you will not be surprised that's a different board, that it drives different decisions, that enables us to do different things. And many of the most important leaders for us through this transformation have been women. And so that is obviously another important way to shift perspectives. And Rachel, you can move to the next. Oh, that was you. You were going to do that one, weren't you? Oh, I just did the one that Rachel was going to do.
I know.
Now what do you want to do?
Keep
Do you want to add
going.
you want to add anything?
No, you said what I was going to say, so that's great.
Oh, shoot.
It's good.
We have the same script.
Indeed.
We do.
Shall I move on to the next?
Yeah, move on to the next
slide.
one. So for this one, we're an organization that has never worked with youth, and we created a high school youth internship project, which is about immersion in nature and about developing pathways to environmental careers. And it's based in North Minneapolis, which again, as I mentioned, is a predominantly Black part of our city. And the short version of what I'll say about this is, up until the day that we agreed to take this on, it was actually a group of community partners that came to us and asked us to do this. We had always said, we don't do youth work. And this one environmental justice leader in particular said, I don't accept that answer. And we said, well, we really don't do youth work. And he said, I need you to do this. This is important. I want Black youth in our city to be in relationship to the people who can give them environmental jobs, who can help solve problems in their communities. I need you to do this. And we said no. The way he tells the story, we said no, I think 7 or 8 times.
A lot of times. Yeah.
A lot of times we kept saying no, and he just would not have it. And so eventually we said yes. And now, not that much, a year and a half later, maybe, we would tell you this is the most important, some of the most important work that we do. And we can't imagine our work without the engagement of youth. So it's another example, like the board example, of how quickly we've been able to shift when we develop different relationships and when we change our understanding of ourselves that enables that change. And then another nice thing about this quickly is we're switching to the next slide. I'll tell you in another example of blurring the lines between my faith life and my work life. We just got some funding from a group of school sisters of Notre Dame for this work. And I don't think we've ever been funded by sisters to do anything before, but they're very excited and we're excited to have them. And it makes perfect sense. Do you want to try this one now? We can swap this one since
I can try this one, but
yeah.
So another portion of our work that we have sort of been tangentially involved in and now more involved in with is the what is the reauthorization of lottery funds. So in Minnesota, some of the lottery money is taken to work to protect Minnesota's environment. So you can see here that the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, which is a very long name, has approximately provided $900 million to some 2,400 projects in environment, but that for, oh goodness, see now it's gonna start rambling because I was not prepared for this one. But that the majority of this money over the years has gone to large organizations. So again, the mainstream environmental organizations that we have talked about, that we have done a fair amount of work with. A lot of it goes to institutions that are like the University of Minnesota or some of the departments in the state. And it is a long and complex process that is full of barriers for any organization that is not does not already have a lot of money and time to be able to upfront pay costs and then be reimbursed later, and also to have the ability to lobby for their particular project. And so this round, the lottery reauthorization is coming up for ballot voters again next year. And what we have been working with a group of mainstream environmental organizations, but also many impacted community groups to create a community grants program, which would be a much easier process to go through and not have all the barriers, stipulations of the current process. And so we have been working in close contact with many groups to try to push this through so that it ends up with a community grant program on the 2024 ballot. I don't know if
No, that was perfect. That's what I would have said. And the latest news is that the Minnesota legislature has now approved this. They just need to, that our House and our Senate have to reconcile two slightly different versions of this grants program. And then the governor will sign it, and then we'll have a $20 million a year fund to support organizations led by people of color, by tribes, by rural communities. So it's a beautiful new opportunity for folks that know what they need in their communities to get the resources to do what they know they need to do. We have so many other examples we can give you. We can tell you more about where we came from, why we changed, what's hard, what we've stumbled on, what we're still struggling with. Whatever's of interest to you, we're happy to share more, or we can dive into one of the stories that we sort of touched on lightly if you want to hear more about it. So happy to take questions. Oh, I see lots of hands. Okay, let's start with Marianne.
Okay, thank you both, Mike and Rachel. I'm really intrigued with this process of going about decision making from different starting points as you incorporate diversity, because there are so many areas in our life right now as a community where we're attempting to try to do some of the same things. So my question is, how did you, I know the process of decision making would be different as you incorporate diversity. And what were some of the very rudimentary or beginning things that you needed to learn how to do differently? Those of you who were at this for a long time before you included so much diversity. What are some practical things for getting that started?
So I've done this for a long time. I've had this job for 26 years. And so, I am the old white guy. I have a biology degree. I fit the profile. And, you learn to believe that there's a right way to do things, and that every other way is the wrong way to do things. And especially in the environmental world, sometimes we fall into this idea that if only everyone listened to us, if only they listened, we know the answer, they just won't listen. And so one of the really powerful things that I've learned is this notion that there of multiple ways of knowing, that there's more than one way of knowing, and that scientific knowledge and all the kinds of expertise that we've lifted up, elevated, and empowered in the environmental movement is legitimate. But for instance, traditional ecological knowledge, to learn the way that one of our northern Minnesota tribes manages their wild rice beds is through an advisory board that is passed down from parent to child. And it's this intimate relationship with the wild rice beds. And so each person is attached to certain beds, and you go out and you visit them, and you determine when it's time to harvest and when it's time to stop. And you think, well, you're going to get better decisions if you have intergenerational knowledge passed along and you have that kind of intimate relationship. So then you have to just check all the things that you thought were the most important things and make space for a different way of knowing. And that's one of the things that it's been hard for me. I'm trained as a biologist, and I just have done this for a long time, and try not to do we tried that nonsense that sometimes leaders who've been in place for a long time say, that shut things down before you hear it all the way out. So for me, that's a lot of it. And the other thing I would just say generally that is true for groups of white people who are trying to embrace a more multicultural way of being is recognizing how comfortable it is to just stay in your place, and how uncomfortable. And I don't mean to make that sound trivial. It's not trivial. It's not that humans want comfort. Humans need comfort. You can't be uncomfortable all the time. And so being able to let go of comfort, at least selectively, at least some of the time, makes it possible for you to move into spaces and places where you don't think you belong, and where there are important things that you need to learn. So it's been a really uncomfortable kind of shift for us as an organization. But I think that's where a lot of the source of the power has been for us, is in that we've developed the capacity to stay uncomfortable, to not flee it, to rush back to comfort as quickly as possible. Did you want to add anything, Rachel?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I really resonate with that, the uncomfortable as well. And to think about, I feel like I have spent so much more time thinking about what it means to be the person in the room who, for most of their lives, have been the person in the uncomfortable space. And that it is time that it is not one person or one group of people or a whole set of group of people who are not white, who have to live in the uncomfort so that we can be comfortable. And it is hard. And I also think that the willingness and realization to make mistakes, but that just because you've made a mistake or you didn't do what you hoped you could do for someone, or you promised them something and it didn't work out, that you don't just stop and say, well, I tried and it didn't work, and so we'll move on. I want to go back to feeling comfortable so I can say that I tried it and now it didn't work, so whoops, sorry, and then be done.
There are little practices too that can help you in those kinds of moments to remember. One of the consultants we were working with taught us this practice that when you're in a group and somebody has to take notes, and you say, who will take notes, in a democratic kind of way. And what he said was, it cannot be the youngest woman in the room. It cannot be and you think, it's always the youngest woman in the room. That's who almost always takes the notes. And so I just try to take the notes in the groups that I'm in. I can do that. But I realized that for 20 years, I probably never kept the notes. I never volunteered. I never kept the notes. So it's just, it seems so trivial. It's like a small thing, but it reminds you, it's difficult to participate and keep the notes. If somebody can do it, I can be the one. Karen.
That's quite a collection of people on your board. I'm interested to know, you and Rachel are here, but how many other people would you say are, I want to say the worker bees, the people who are doing the things? What kind of size of organization are you working with? I have no idea, because I know it's not always the board. They're in a totally different relationship to the organization. So I'm just fascinated by what it would be. And again, like Marianne, we're trying to think of, we've always done this, we're predominantly white, now older, women's educated community. Where do we need to go? Or, so anyway, that's a question about how big is your organization, or what does it encompass? Thank you.
We are currently a staff of about 20. I think we're at 20 right now. I can never remember. In the process of hiring 2 additional people, but we have sort of, since I've been here at least, we've bounced sort of a few above and a few below 20 for a number of years. But we can also say that still, as much as our board has changed over the last 5 years, the staff is still predominantly white. And so we have been working hard to change some of our hiring practices to try to, and our recruitment of potential new staff, to try to expand not just our representation on our board, but within our staff as well. So continue to work on that.
Thanks. I would be interested in knowing, as you enter into relationship with groups of people or projects, how do you keep a sustainable relationship with them? I know oftentimes groups do fund projects and then the money is given, or the finances or the resources are given. But the issue then is, how does the relationship continue to be developed and sustained over time? And how does that work for you? And you've answered some of that question, but actually on the practical level, how do you continue to maintain that connection when the project itself may be going forward, but how do you sustain that relationship? Thanks.
Want me to start? Yeah.
Sure.
No? Well, Northside Safety Net that is a terrific question. And because we're so project-based, right? So projects come and go. We were just out at a tree planting site where another organization had come into a predominantly Black neighborhood, planted a bunch of trees, and then left. And they didn't engage the neighbors at all. And so the neighbors just organized themselves and decided to keep these trees alive. So they've been watering the trees and keeping them alive. But the neighbors had a lot to say because we were there planting trees that day. So they had a lot to say about, how they wanted to relate to us and how they wanted to stay in relationship to us. And they didn't want us parachuting in and parachuting out. But Northside Safety Net is a good example of that dynamic, Marilyn, that, I told you already, we tried not to take it. We did take it. And then we took it and thought, well, this is actually this is great. This is what we should be doing. We should have been doing this 20 years ago. And then we ran out of money. And these are high school students. Many of the high school students are using the stipends that we pay them. So we're paying them to supplement their family income. And many of them are upperclassmen, and so they're on their way. One of the seniors just was accepted and committed to Loyola in Chicago, and she's in environmental studies there. It's a great school for that. But we ran out of money, and so in our world, if you run out of money, you stop doing the work. But these are kids who are depending on this work. This is a long path towards something. So the individual that runs the program for us, the staff member for us that runs the program, worked hard to find other internships for them this summer, and also persuaded us to scrape together a little bit of money from our own resources to pay them as consultants over the summer to us. And so we'll stay in relationship with the students, and not a exploitative or extractive relationship, one where we're paying them for their knowledge. And then we are actually close to having enough money to bring them back in the fall. So, that's a good example. And I give the credit in this case to, her name is JC, who's been leading that program. She just would not let us drop this. She just would not. But the easy thing is to drop it. Pat?
Yeah, could you say something about your model of co-leadership? And what that entails and how important that might be to your organization. And secondly, I know in the transformation stage, you've often said that you had to have courageous listening. How would you define that?
I can start on that one because I was thinking about the last question and how we keep our connections going over time. And I was going to say, I think part of what that is this co-leadership model, and that it is not just one person in our organization now who knows the one person at wherever, and those are the only two people who talk. So if somebody leaves, that's the end of that relationship. Or if something happens or you get moved to a project or whatever, that it is not just being held by one person anymore. And I think I've really seen a change since I have been here. And that I think early on when I started, it was like, Mike should talk to this person. Mike knows this person. Mike is the person. And Mike has a bazillion connections, which is amazing. But now I feel like it's much more that many of us know who this person is. Or, we have also talked to this person or emailed this person or have some sort of at least basis of relationship with somebody else, and so that it is an easier time to keep that connection going when there is change on either end. And so I think we have also been working to make more than one connection at a location as well, at whether it be a company or a community or a state entity, and that we know that the more of us who are together in this work and the more of us who know each other, the more impact that we are going to have in the longer term, and that it is not just because Mike knows the head of this person that we can have this, but if they decide they don't like each other or they don't, whatever, for whatever reason, it's not done. And so I think that has made a huge difference in also ownership within our staff, to feel like they have more ownership of the relationships and the project. And so they're more invested in the work. And so I think it's made a huge difference in how, I know I have felt that in the last few years, like that I know some of these people. We just had our award celebration, and I was like, I realized that I know so many of these people in these rooms because I have talked to them in some capacity. And that would not, I think, necessarily have been the case of, an early on administrative assistant wouldn't have known the people. But now I get to know who these people are and I get to talk to them as well. So it's made me more invested in wanting to be here and see things through.
And I'll say that's part of the advantage of having a strategic plan that everyone has agreed to, right? That it's not just that I know or somebody else, we all have a common plan. So we can all do our place, and those values are just as important to Rachel as they are to me. And I know that that's true. And so of course, Rachel can be the same kind of relationship connection that I can be. We have the same capacity or more similar capacity because we're working from the same plan. One other aspect of co-leadership I was going to mention. So, I've been here a long time, and it isn't always the right decision to have the old white guy that developed a lot of the structures that you're now trying to dismantle stay in place. And there was a period where I thought that the board was going to ask me to leave, and I offered to leave. And they said, no, we want you to stay, in part because it makes sense for me to be the one to dismantle some of the things that I have so diligently built. That's not the work of people who have been harmed by those ways of doing things. That should be my work in some ways. But I've been really advocating for and supporting a sense that our leadership in the organization is not one person, but that there are four of us in what we call our executive team. So if you look at that staff list, you'll find Ellen Gibson, Sasha Seymour Anderson, and Bill Dressler. And we four at least understand ourselves to be co-directors. We have not asked for that to be formalized, mostly because we know the board would not quite be able to say, yes, we're letting go of the idea that there's one person who we focus on, and to be able to wrap their heads around the idea that there are four. But we keep moving progressively in that direction. In fact, Bill is getting ready to retire. He's about 2 years from retirement. And so our intention is to really pull that into a tighter group of three. So it'd be Sasha, Ellen, and me. And I'm always waiting for that moment where we can be really explicit that it isn't a model of me and then everyone else, but a group of us who hold that leadership together. And I know it's challenging, and I know that is countercultural, but it's better, and it's better for me. I mean, I have loved control over my years, but I prefer not to be put into this position, which is a lie anyway, that it's all about one individual or one person's relationships or one person's judgment. It just isn't. Thank goodness. Thank God it's not. And then Pat, you asked about listening.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Courageous.
Courageous listening. Do you have anything you want to start on that, Rachel?
I do not.
I give my church life credit for this, that I was just a terrible, terrible listener for a good chunk of my life, and learned through a variety of programs at church the skills. I mean, listening involves skills. I mean, it's a value system, but it's also skills. And so through a program called Befrienders, have you ever heard of it? I learned a lot of listening skills about 15 years ago, and 20 years ago. And so it's really powerful, I have to say, to be able to show up in a relationship without being there to drive something, to get something done, to get something out of it. And so to really be able to show up in a relationship and listen. One of our Indigenous board members says, we don't need you to come here and solve our problems. She's a member of one of the Dakota tribes here in southern Minnesota. And she says, we don't need you to we need you to show up and listen so you could help us do what we know we need to do. I think, well, that's a worthwhile skill. I mean, you want to be helpful, you want to be useful, you have to be able to make the space. But there's tension for us because, we're driven by budgets and timelines and deliverables and our agenda. So really being able to quiet all of that, it just takes practice. But with practice, I think it's the heart of how you build a relationship that can be sustained over time, even when you're in some tension. Because if you listen carefully enough, you'll have some connection at the core that will be able to survive whatever the tension of the moment is. Did that answer the question, Pat? I don't know if that was what you had in mind.
I think that the answer will be a continuous one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Well, I'll give you one other version, which is that we've been so oriented in the last couple of years towards the communities that we've ignored, communities of color, tribes, and rural communities, that we've let our business relationships atrophy a little bit and our governmental relationships. And so now our board member chair is saying, well, we should get all your staff to come to the next Minnesota Chamber of Commerce dinner, because that might also be uncomfortable. I think, okay, I think that's right. I think we need to show up and be open-minded and hear and be willing to show up in places that make us uncomfortable.
Would you be willing to share your why? What was the thing that brought you to these choices?
Personally or the organization?
Yes.
I was telling my story recently to a woman who is just so phenomenal to be in this community. She was the environmental justice coordinator for the Jesuit Order of North America. And she was the environmental justice coordinator for the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. She's phenomenal. I'm so happy to meet her. So I told this story about my divided life. And she was so kind and so generous. And she said, that must have been hard. I said, Cecilia, that was not hard. That was easy. It is easy to embrace comfort when you show up in a room and people are going to listen to you. And if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll be well paid for it. And that you'll get to go home at the end of the night and not worry too much about it. It is easy. And so, but I, the reason why I go back to my early story is because that's not who I am. That really is not who I am. I made that choice. It was a choice, but it was always available to me to make a different choice. And I really went through a period of burnout in 2007 and 2008. And I went through a leadership renewal program. And I came out of that program in 2008, knowing that I needed to find a way to tie my social justice work and my environmental work together. And then it took a while for the organization to get to that point as well, but I'm glad that it did. I mean, I got to continue to live out the best version of my work that I was capable of in an organization that was ready for the same change. The reason why we changed as an organization is because everyone in the environmental world knows that this is true. The Environmental Protection Agency wrote an environmental justice policy in the 80s. And in the 80s, they said, it's white people making all the decisions, but it's people of color who are suffering. In the 80s. And one of our staff had come to me with this statement and said, what? This was written in the 80s. You all have known this since the 80s? What have you done? That was Lily, Rachel. And yes. So for years, we could acknowledge, my board said when they were all a bunch of guys, white guys would say, oh, we need diversity, we need diversity. Yes. So we've known it. What made it impossible to stay is that our mission is to bring people together across difference. Our premise is that it is a difference of perspective that produces the best outcomes, right? Well, how do you get away with saying that to groups of people who all look the same? It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable for the whole environmental movement, but it's really unacceptable for us. It just rings false. And so we got to the point where enough of these blows kind of came back to us that our minds were opened. And I give the board and staff a lot of credit because they stepped through that door. And because we've been willing to make it an 8-year process. If we had been impatient, if we had tried to do this in a year or two, we would have given up. But because we see it as culture change, which we say is a 7 to 10 year process, and I guess it's not 10 because we're in the middle and we're at 8, so maybe it's a 16-year process. We've been able to be patient with ourselves and to forgive ourselves, but it's just not. The environmental movement has gone as far as it can. We cannot solve the problems that face us, including climate change, with the current configuration of old white guys. You just cannot. It will not work. What would you say about the organization's change? You don't have the same change story that I have, Rachel. Personally.
I do not. No, I think the question was the why. My why really, I had a child in 2014, and it feels like in the time of her short and young life so far, there has been such a dire feeling of climate change and what that is going to do for such very soon future generations. And I think about, if I am sitting here right now living a very comfortable life, I can't ensure that for her or for any of the people, any of her peers. And I think about, she's got a very comfortable life right now, but how many of her similar aged kids who are not living in the comfort life that she has right now, and collectively won't, if we don't do everything we can do right now. And so it feels like such an urgent problem for us now, for our next generation. But if we hope to have future human generations beyond that, we have got some serious work to do. And it does involve everybody. And it really involves listening to the people who haven't been listened to, who would not have made these terrible destructive choices, presumably, when the white people did. And so if it's not us now, who is it going to be?
Well, I want to thank, I think the word thank doesn't even begin to put into perspective, Mike and Rachel, because how can one thank one for one's life, and more importantly, for being willing to move in directions that are uncomfortable, that really maybe we sense a loss of power around. So I see you both in your organization as transformational witnesses to our communities in many, many ways. And not only that, but for me personally, your personal support, because I think any organization like yours, unless you have that kind of personal support, you run up against walls, both personally, individually, and I have run up against many walls here with Indigenous peoples, and you've been there, you've walked the walk. I think part of the transformation that I see in your organization, that each one of you walk the walk. It's one thing to say it, but it's another to walk the walk. It's one thing to give money, but it's another thing to really get messy down in the earth with the person that you're giving the money to. And I see you doing that. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I know all of us here thank you. I was going to have Susie play the song again of Laura, but instead I'm being led to have us take away from this time with looking at the words of the song and just take away these perspectives. I'm going to do it, and I invite you to do it. And her title of her song is "These Are Sacred Lands," but this is what I think her song is saying to us. Can we hear? What is in our hearts? What do we need our best to rise above in order to create something. How do we really see, and what do we see? And who do we see? And as a community, a diverse community, especially those that are less visible, are they grateful for me being in their life? How grateful are the poor for us in their life? So with that, I thank you all for being part of this.